Muy buenas tardes. Les damos la bienvenida a esta serie de conferencias que estamos organizando entre la Facultad de Psicología y la Escuela Nacional de Lenguas, Lingüística y Traducción de la UNAM. En esta ocasión, contamos con la participación de la doctora Malin Terbeke, quien presentará la conferencia Hand Gestures Have Predictive Potential During Conversations. Los invitamos a escribir sus preguntas y comentarios en el chat de la sesión. Pueden escribirlas en inglés o en español y nosotros se las vamos a transmitir a ella. Al final de la charla, les daremos las respuestas en vivo de la doctora Terbeke para que pueda contestarles sus dudas. Welcome, Dr. Terbeke. It is a pleasure to have you with us in this session. Before giving you the floor, I would like to share a brief introduction about you with our audience. Bienvenida, doctora Terbeke. Es un placer contar con su presencia en esta conferencia. Antes de cederle la palabra, me permitiré compartir con nuestro auditorio una breve semblanza suya. La doctora Terbeke cursó el doctorado en el grupo de comunicación en la interacción social en el Donders Center for Cognition, bajo la supervisión de la doctora Linda Drivers y la doctora Judith Holler. En su proyecto titulado Procesamiento del lenguaje multimodal en la interacción, investiga cómo las señales visuales o los gestos afectan la predicción del lenguaje, así como otros mecanismos de procesamiento lingüístico. Para ello, ha empleado una combinación de métodos basados en corpus y técnicas electrofisiológicas con EEG. Desde su licenciatura, se ha especializado en matemáticas y neurociencia cognitiva, así como en psicología y en lingüística. Con esta formación interdisciplinaria, continuó sus estudios con la maestría en neurociencia cognitiva en la Universidad de Radboud, especializándose en lenguaje y comunicación. Durante sus estudios de maestría dentro del grupo de lenguaje y cognición multimodal, estudió la relación entre la manera en que las personas describen eventos mediante el habla y los gestos y cómo recuerdan dichos eventos. A continuación, la doctora Terbeke nos presentará su conferencia Hand Gestures Have Predictive Potential During Conversations. La ponencia, tomará aproximadamente 45 minutos y posteriormente tendremos entre 10 y 15 minutos para sus preguntas. Dr. Terbeke, the floor is yours, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Do you now see my screen?
Yeah, very well said.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I wanted to start off also with a little bit of introduction to myself because I didn't expect this very professional introduction, but maybe I can be quick. So, yeah, I'm a PhD candidate currently at the Donders Institute, which is in the Netherlands, and I work and live in a beautiful small city called Nijmegen, where we have around 200,000 people. So it's a really small city. And as you can see in the picture, it's beautifully located next to a river. So that's very nice for summer. And this is the cover of my PhD thesis, which I've just finished. Today I received all the books, so I'm very excited to hand them out to everyone and celebrate this achievement. And as you can see, my work is on how gestures facilitate prediction and fast responding during conversation. And the work I'll be talking about today also comes from my PhD thesis. These are my supervisors, Dr. Linda Drivers, Dr. Judith Holler. Everything I'll be talking about today I've done in collaboration with them, so it's important that they are also acknowledged. And today I'll mainly be talking about this one paper called Hand Gestures Have Predictive Potential During Conversation, an investigation of the timing of gestures in relation to speech. And this was the first paper of my PhD, and it was kind of a sort of the foundation for all the experiments I've done afterwards. This was a corpus study. So I'll mainly be talking about this one today, but I'll also give a few brief insights into the work that I've done afterwards. So I'd like to start off with a picture of a situation that's very common in everyday life, namely face-to-face conversation. And face-to-face conversation is the natural environment in which language has evolved, in which language is learned, and in which language is most often used. And therefore, to understand how language works, I think it's very important that we understand how language is used and processed in face-to-face conversation. And importantly, in conversations, people take turns at talking. So you switch between talking and listening all the time. And when people do this turn taking, they rapidly respond to each other. So for example, suppose the man on the left here would ask the woman in the middle a question, like, what do you think of the view? Then she could take her turn and reply by saying, it's beautiful. And in a typical conversation, such responses to questions happen very rapidly, often starting around 0 to 200 milliseconds after the question has ended. And this is incredibly fast, especially if we consider that planning to say a single word can take up to 600 milliseconds, and planning to say longer phrases like it's beautiful can take up to 1500 milliseconds. So this means that while listeners are still listening to a turn that they're hearing, they're already planning their response. And how people manage these fast responses, despite their relatively slow production systems, is one of the central questions in psycholinguistics. And it's been argued that it involves predictive comprehension, with listeners predicting, for example, the social action or speech act of an incoming turn. For example, is it going to be a question or a statement? Listeners also predict the propositional content of the turns, like the words that are going to be in it, and also the turn end. So they also predict when they think that the speaker is going to stop talking, basically. And all of this predictive comprehension together allows for fast responding. But importantly, and as we can see in this picture, in face-to-face conversation, we don't only communicate with speech, but also with visual bodily signals, such as hand gestures. And in my work, I'm interested in how multimodality, and more specifically seeing hand gestures, facilitates this language processing during conversation, focusing on fast responding and prediction. So how does seeing hand gestures facilitate prediction and fast responding during conversation? That's the main question that I've tried to answer so far in my work. And today I'll be talking about a corpus study that also relates to this question. And this corpus study had two main research questions. First, I wanted to know, could hand gestures be used to predict upcoming meaning? And to answer this question, I looked at the timing of gestures in relation to speech as they are done during natural conversation. And secondly, I wanted to know, does seeing hand gestures facilitate fast responding? And to look at this, I looked at response times during conversation. So could hand gestures be used to predict upcoming meaning? As I've just mentioned, people also produce communicative signals with their bodies while they are in conversation, while they're talking, for example, hand gestures. And it has been proposed that listeners also use these visual bodily signals to predict upcoming meaning. And specifically in my work, I look at representational hand gestures. And these are hand gestures that depict meaning. And it includes several different types of gestures that depict meaning. So for example, it includes iconic gestures. These are gestures that depict concrete concepts, like actions or objects. So an example could, for example, be a drinking gesture to depict the word drink, or a gesture like this to represent the ball. But gestures can also be used to depict meaning in a more abstract way. And these are called metaphoric gestures. And these depict abstract concepts. And an example would, for example, be saying balance while using the hands like this when you talk about balance in an abstract sense, like, oh, it was hard to find work-life balance, for example. And the final category that's part of these representational hand gestures that I looked at are pointing gestures. This could, for example, involve pointing to objects or locations that are physically with you in the space. So I could, for example, point at a door when I'm in the same room with you. But people can also point at more abstract locations in space. And these are also part of representational hand gestures. And what I wanted to know is, could these hand gestures be used to predict the corresponding speech? So could, for example, a drinking gesture be used to predict the corresponding word drink? And for this, I looked at the gesture speech timing. Because for this prediction to be possible, it's important that the information in the gesture precedes the corresponding information in speech. If I, for example, first say the word drink and then do a drinking gesture, then the gesture would be too late to be used for prediction. So we need the gesture to start before the corresponding speech. And previous work has often shown that gestures indeed start before their corresponding speech. But what was missing from these previous studies are quantitative analysis based on large data sets with a large number of speakers who talk about a wide range of topics. So a lot of this previous work, for example, was more qualitative and focused on individual cases of gestures. But we want to know, does this really hold when we look at a large number of gestures? Can we really generalize? And some of the previous studies were based on a small number of speakers. But we want to know, is this gesture speech timing really something that we see across different speakers? So that's why we used a large number of speakers. And some previous work, participants had to talk about very specific things. So for example, participants always had to talk about objects. While in natural conversation, people talk about a wide range of topics. People use gestures that don't depict objects. So to get a more wider sense of how this gesture speech timing looks like in natural conversation, we used a corpus that captures this wide range of gesturally depicted meanings, a wide range of communicative intentions and conversation topics, thus enhancing the generalizability of conclusions that we can draw about gesture speech timing. So to answer the second question, do hand gestures facilitate fast responding? Some previous work has already looked at this. In one previous study, they looked at conversations between three people, so triadic conversations, and these were English speakers. And they looked at whether questions that are produced with a gesture get faster responses than questions that are produced without a gesture. And they found that indeed questions with gestures get faster responses. So here is a plot of these results. So on the x-axis, we see the response times to the questions, where 0 means that a response started exactly when a question stopped. Yes. A positive response time means that there was a small gap between the question and the response. And a negative response time means that there was a little bit of overlap between the question and the start of the response. And here in the pink line, we see the response times to questions with gesture. And in the blue dotted line, we see the response times to questions without gesture. And what we see is that the pink distribution is shifted to the left, so earlier in time compared to the other distribution, showing that these questions with gestures get faster responses. And later I'll be showing a bit more plots that look like this. So yeah, keep this in mind. Although this was a super interesting study, some things were still missing, and those were things that we added with our study. This study actually looked at many different types of gestures combined. So they had hand gestures and head gestures combined. They had different functions of gestures combined. Then we wanted to see, does this speeding up also hold when we only look at gestures that depict meaning? Moreover, they only focused on questions, but of course in conversation, not everything you say is a question. So we also wanted to look at turns that don't have a question function. Do we also see that hand gestures facilitate fast responding for those turns? And we were specifically interested in this comparison because this rapid turn taking and these fast responses are especially important for questions. Because when you ask someone a question, it is really expected that the other person responds quickly. And if the response time is slower, that's really meaningful. So if I, for example, invite you to my party and you're silent, then I will think, oh, this person doesn't want to come to my party. So responding to a question there, the time pressure is really important, but this is less so for questions, for turns that have different functions. So that's why we made this comparison. And finally, we also wanted to see whether questions with more preceding gestures, so gestures that start earlier relative to their lexical affiliate or their corresponding information in speech, do these gestures especially result in faster responses? So to look at this, we collected a corpus that consisted of 34 dyads of acquainted participants, so 34 pairs of friends, basically, and they could sign up together, so they already knew each other. The mean age of the participants was around 23. And all the participants were fluent speakers of Dutch who learned this language while they were growing up. And in total, participants talked to each other for 60 minutes, but this was split up in 3 different sections, basically. So in the first 20 minutes, they held a free and entirely unguided conversation. So we just told them, talk about whatever you want, like you would normally talk to each other if you were meeting up. In the second 20 minutes, they had to hold a discussion. So they talked about either privacy, social media, or the use of English language in higher education in the Netherlands. And these topics were chosen to spark discussion even among closer friends. And participants were encouraged to discuss their opinions and explore their agreements and disagreements. And in the final 20 minutes, participants planned a holiday together. So they were asked to talk about their ideal affordable holiday for the 2 of them together. And they were really asked to make a compromise between both of their wishes. So this is a picture of what our corpus looked like. So as you can see, participants were talking in the lab. This lab was soundproof, so that's very good for the audio recordings. And as you can see, we filmed them from many different angles. We even had 2 additional angles that I haven't shown here. But we had on the top left, you see full body angle of the first participant. On the top right, you see the full body angle of the second participant. And then in the bottom corners, you can see that we also had a camera that was kind of leaning over the shoulder, looking from above. So we also had this perspective on the gesture, so you could always really well see what the hands were doing. And then we also had in the bottom in the middle, you see that we also had a view where we saw the 2 participants together and their interaction as a whole from the side. So once we collected all of this data, of course, we had to code it. And we coded it for various things. So first we coded all the questions that occurred during the conversations. And for each question, we also noted down the response and we calculated the response time. So how much time was there between at the end of the question and the start of the response? Then we also coded the non-question turns, the responding turns, and again, the response times. We didn't code the non-question turns for all of the conversations or for the whole conversations because these non-question turns happen a lot. This would have been a lot of work, but we only did this for segments or parts of the free conversation, since this is the most natural part of our data set. And then we coded these representational gestures that occurred along with the questions and the non-question turns. And for each gesture, we also coded the gesture phases. So gestures can be split up into different phases where, for example, if I would do a typing gesture, for example, the first part is always the preparation, where the hands go from the resting space, or for example, from my lap, the hands move up to the gesture space, and they also prepare the hand shape already. Then there is the stroke, which is the most meaningful part of the gesture. So that would, for example, be wiggling the fingers to depict typing. Then there's the retraction, where the hands go back to the rest position, for example, back to the lap. And there can also be holds, so moments where the hands are still, either right before the stroke or right after the stroke. So for each gesture, we coded on a frame-by-frame basis, where do all of these phases start and end. And then we also coded the lexical affiliates. And what the lexical affiliate means is this is the word or the words deemed to correspond most closely to the gesture in meaning. So for example, if I would say, what would you like to drink? And I do a drinking gesture, then from my speech, we would choose the word drink as the lexical affiliate. And the lexical affiliate is a concept that has sometimes been critiqued a little bit because some people say that gestures depict meaning more holistically. But for us, it was still a useful concept to use and to look at this gesture speech timing. So this is an example of what the coding looked like. This is from software called ENALLT that we use. So here on the top left, we can see the participants. And then on the bottom, we see different rows of information that we coded. So for example, now the arrow points at the question that the participants on the left asked. Then we would also code the response from the participant on the right. We would code the lexical affiliate, so the word in the question that corresponds most closely to the gesture. In this case, this was kaart, which means map. And then on the bottom row, we see the gesture coding. So the P stands for preparation, and the S stands for stroke, and the R stands for retraction. And what we see here is that the start of the preparation is actually quite a bit earlier than the lexical affiliate. And we see that this also holds for the start of the stroke. So both the preparation and the stroke in this example start before the corresponding speech. And this pattern, it's not only the case in this example, but this is what we see overall in the whole data set. So to move on to the results, we found that gesture onsets precede lexical affiliate onsets. 94% of gestures started before their lexical affiliate, and on average, gestures started around 640 milliseconds before the lexical affiliate. So here I've also plotted this again as a distribution. So on the x-axis, we see the difference in time between when the gesture started and when the lexical affiliate started. And here a negative value means that the gesture started before the lexical affiliate, and a positive value means that it started afterwards. And we can see in the black line, we see the average of 644 milliseconds, and the dotted lines represent the standard deviation. And the colored bar means the amount of gestures that started before. So we can really see that this is the overwhelming majority. And this is the timing data during questions. But when we look at the timing data during non-question turns, we can see that this is really similar. Next, we looked at the onset of the stroke, and we again found that stroke onsets precede lexical affiliate onsets. So 60% of the strokes start before their lexical affiliate, and on average, strokes started around 200 milliseconds before the lexical affiliate. So again, we can plot this. We can see that how much the stroke precedes the lexical affiliate is less than when we only look at the gesture onset, but we still see that that they clearly start before. And again, this was the case for questions, and it looks very similar for the non-question turns. So based on this, we can say that gestures have predictive potential. So when we look at sort of the average timeline of gestures in relation to speech, we see that the gestures start before the corresponding speech. The same holds for the most meaningful part of the gesture. And in this time window indicated by the red dotted line, in principle, the listener could already use the gesture to predict the word that comes next. Now, based on this gesture speech timing, prediction of the semantic information of the lexical affiliate is possible based on hand gestures. So to move on to the results about fast responding. So we found that questions with hand gestures get faster responses. So here I've plotted this again. This is a plot that looks similar to the one I showed you in the introduction. In yellow, we see the response times to the questions with gestures. And in blue, we see the response times to the questions without gestures. And what we can see is that the response times to the questions with gestures, so in yellow, are again shifted to the left, so earlier in time, compared to the questions without gestures. And we also performed a follow-up analysis on this, because one possibility is that these responses are only faster because participants quickly respond with what we call a turn initial placeholder. So a word like or well, because that could be a way to respond quickly without actually having to say anything meaningful yet. So what we did is we recalculated the response times from the first non-placeholder word. So for example, if a response was, I don't know yet, then instead of counting the response time from the word we would count it from the word I. And when we recalculated the data like this, we again found that questions with gestures got faster responses. And actually, the effect size became a little bit bigger. So this shows that participants don't respond faster just because they quickly say to sort of make the response in time, but they actually respond in a meaningful way. Then we also looked at whether questions with more preceding gestures get especially fast responses. So for gestures that precede their lexical affiliate more, the listener might have more time to use this gesture to predict the lexical affiliate, and this could possibly result in faster responses. But unfortunately, we found no evidence for this. So we found no relation between the gesture lexical affiliate timing and response times, and also not between the stroke lexical affiliate timing and response times. Yeah, and I'll come back to this a little bit in the discussion. And interestingly, we found that the non-question turns with hand gestures did not get faster responses. So here again, we show the response times, and you can see that the non-question turns with gestures in yellow get very similar response times to the non-question turns without gestures in blue. We have a lot of overlap between the response times, and also the mean response times are very comparable. So let's move on to the discussion. So we concluded that gestures have predictive potential. And this replicates earlier work showing that gestures precede speech, but we show for the first time that this pattern also holds in a corpus of natural face-to-face conversation, in which a large number of participants talked in a range of communicative situations and about a wide range of topics. We also saw that the gesture speech timing was stable across turn types. We saw similar gesture speech timing for questions and non-question turns, and also when we compare the three conversation topics, so the free conversation, the discussion, and the holiday planning, we see similar gesture speech timing in all of these settings. And importantly, this means that it's possible for listeners to use the gestural information to predict the lexical affiliate. And this is what we call the gestures have predictive potential. But of course, an important question here is, do listeners actually do this? So with this data, we show it's possible, but what about whether listeners actually do it? And to follow up on this question, in my PhD, I've done some more experimental work. So in one experiment, we asked, do comprehenders use speakers' gestures to predict upcoming meaning? And this is a figure showing the stimuli. So what participants did is they watched videos in which a virtual avatar asked them questions. So you can see the virtual avatar in the figure. And on top of the figure, you can see a timeline of what the questions look like. So all of them first had sort of the bulk of the question. For example, how old were you when you learned to? Then there was a short silent pause, and then there was the target word, for example, type. And right before the silent pause, the avatar would either produce an iconic gesture depicting the target word, like typing, or she would produce a control movement that also has movement that looks similar, but that's not related to speech in a meaningful way, like, for example, rubbing the hands. And these gestures and their target words were taken from the corpus study that I've just told you about, because we really wanted to see whether the gestures that people naturally produce during conversation are these gestures possible for listeners to use for prediction, rather than very artificial gestures that we would just make up ourselves. So I want to show some videos of what these stimuli look like. So the stimuli are in Dutch, but she says, how old were you when you learned to type? So right before type, there is the silent pause.
Hoe oud was je ongeveer toen je leerde typen?
So here you can see that she produced the typing gesture that is based on a typing gesture that we saw in natural conversation.
Hoe oud was je ongeveer toen je leerde typen?
It already started. It's always difficult to play videos in PowerPoint. But this was the control condition where you could see how she was rubbing her hand. And this control movement occurred in exactly the same location as the gesture. Yes, here I want it to be. So we use these, first use these stimuli in a closed test. And a closed test is an experiment where we stop the videos during the silent pause. So participants would see the videos up to how old were you when you learned to, and then it would stop, and then we asked them, how do you think that the speaker will continue? And we had 60 participants, and across participants, and the items were seen in 3 conditions. So either with the gesture that I showed you, with a control movement, and we also had a condition where there was no hand movement at all. So where participants would just see the avatar and her hands would just stay still in the lap. And what we saw is that gestures improve these explicit predictions. So when participants were asked to fill in how they thought the question would continue, they were more often correct when they had seen the gesture compared to when they had seen the control movement or no hand movement, and there was no difference between the control movement and no hand movement. And in the B panel, you can see that even when the predictions were incorrect, when they had seen the gestures, these predictions were still more semantically similar to the target word than when they had seen the control movement or no hand movement. So then we also use these stimuli in a second experiment, because of course, when you're in natural conversation, you're not constantly actively predicting what is this person going to say next, but you're just listening. So for this, we used an EEG experiment with the same stimuli, but then participants were just listening. And now we use 2 conditions, only the gesture condition and the control movement condition. Yes, and what I wanted to say is that during the silent pause, we looked at pre-stimulus oscillations. We looked at alpha and beta oscillations, which have been used as a marker of anticipation or prediction. And when participants heard the target word, we looked at the N400. This is an event-related potential, which reflects semantic processing difficulty. So this could show us whether it was easier for participants to process the word if they've already seen the gesture. And at this N400 window, we saw that gestures reduced the N400 when they heard the target word, showing facilitated semantic processing. And during the silent window, we saw the gestures reduced alpha and beta power during the silent pause, indicating anticipation. So we concluded that comprehenders can indeed use these iconic gestures to predict upcoming meaning. Yes. So this study showed that when you see the whole gesture, prediction is possible. But we also wanted to see whether even seeing the gesture preparation, so the first part of the gesture, whether that can already help. And this was a study that was done with Lina van Otterdijk, who was a master's student with us at the time. And what she did is she used videos from the corpus and showed them to participants in an experiment. And they would see and listen to the participant talking, and the participant would be blurred, but it would be either unblurred when the gesture preparation was there, so participants would see the preparation, or she would remain blurred. And participants again had to type in how they thought that the speaker would continue. And when participants saw the preparation, they predicted words that were more similar to the lexical affiliate than if the preparation was blurred. Showing that even these gesture preparations can improve predictions. Okay, so this was a little side quest into prediction, but let's go back to the discussion of the corpus results for a little bit. So we found that the non-question turns with gestures did not get faster responses. And as I talked about in the introduction, questions come with the normative expectation that they are responded to, and the response times to questions carry pragmatic meaning. And this is less so for non-question turns. And perhaps due to this different time pressure, gestures played a smaller role in speeding up response times to non-question turns. But interestingly, another study found, actually, after we did our work, that non-question turns with gestures do get faster responses, but they coded things differently than we did. So we looked at full turns, but they looked at turn constructional units, which are the units that turns are built of. So perhaps at this smaller scale, when you look at this smaller scale, you actually do see these beneficial effects. Yeah, regardless of the reason, this calls for the need for more qualitative research into the circumstances under which gestures result in faster response. Sorry, I have a bit of a sore throat. So we also found that questions with gestures do get faster responses. And we thus provided additional evidence that questions with hand gestures get faster responses, extending this to dyadic conversations, to Dutch, and to representational gestures compared to previous work. We also showed for the first time that these responses are not simply faster because recipients use turn initial placeholders like or to minimize the response times, but people actually provide meaningful responses. And we found that how much the gesture sped up responses was not related to how much a gesture preceded this lexical affiliate. But this is something that we should be cautious in interpreting this too much, because this was about different questions and different in many different aspects. It was not a controlled setting at all. And future work, experimental work, could, for example, manipulate the gesture speech timing while keeping everything else the same to see if the timing of gestures really doesn't matter for response times. Also, an important question is this a causal effect? In the corpus, we could see that there was a correlation between gesture presence and faster responses, but we don't know whether gestures actually causally speed up responses. So to look at this, I performed an experiment in which participants saw videos of an actress that asked questions. And they saw these videos either with a corresponding iconic gesture or without. Then they had to respond to the questions as fast and accurately as possible with a button press. And again, we saw that gestures speed up responses to questions, showing that it's really due to the gesture and that these responses are faster. And here an important question is this faster responding due to the meaning of the gestures, or is it simply because participants see biological motion? And this motion might attract more attention to what someone is saying, or it might make them feel more addressed or activated. So we ran another experiment in which we added another condition, namely a control movement condition. And here we saw that the gestures again sped up responses, but the control movements did not, showing that it's really about the meaning in the gestures. So meaning matters. And as a final study in my PhD, I wanted to link this faster responding and this prediction together to see, do gestures speed up responses because of prediction? In this study, I had 60 participants, and these participants again watched the videos of the avatar, but now they had to respond to them, again with a yes or no button press. And I asked, do gestures that improve predictions more also speed up responses more? And I found that this is indeed the case. So that's what we see in this plot. So on the x-axis, we see prediction improvement. So how much did each gesture improve prediction? And on the y-axis, we see the response times. And the response times are plotted in blue for the control movements and in orange for the gesture. And what we see is that the difference in response times between the gestures and the control movements becomes bigger the more the gestures improve predictions, and that the more towards the right of the x-axis these response times start to diverge more, showing that gestures really speed up responses through prediction. So, to conclude, gestures have predictive potential during conversation. Despite the challenge of having to integrate information from gesture and speech under significant time constraints, seeing gestures actually facilitates language processing during conversation. And the specific temporal organization of these multimodal signals, equipping gestures with predictive potential, may be at the very heart of this facilitation. And some open questions are, of course, still left. So one important thing is to see, how do these results generalize to other languages? Is this something that we see in Dutch, or do we also see these preceding gestures and this faster responding in other languages? Another question is, why are gestures typically produced earlier than their lexical affiliates? That's something that my research can't say anything about, but I think it's important to find out. And another question is, do other visual signals also have predictive potential? So, for example, other types of hand gestures, head gestures, facial expressions, could these also be used to predict what someone might say next? Perhaps not on the semantic level, but on a different level. Could, for example, early eyebrow movements be used to predict that someone will ask a question? I think these are important steps for future work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving this interesting talk, Marilyn. And now we have some time for questions from our audience. So we can start with one from the audience that we have right now in the chat on YouTube. And it's probably related to the notion of the biological motion that you just presented a few moments ago. So it says mainly, good morning. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's been useful to think about my research on ritual dances. About that, do you think that the ritual gestures with hands, but also with the body of the dancers, can be understood as a narration? And can we understand gestures and movements without speaking? What do you think about it?
Interesting question.
Right.
So what we know is that gestures are typically considered more ambiguous when there is no speech. So there's experiments where participants see gestures and they have to type in what they think a gesture means. And we can really see that this is more difficult when there's no co-occurring speech. So gestures are really part of the production, that's part of the speech, but without, they're much more difficult to interpret. Yeah, this may of course be very different from ritual dances, which I unfortunately don't know a lot about, but which sounds super interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And about the coding that you had to implement for all the videos that you had for the corpus, could you elaborate a little bit more on how you trained these coders on, or what would be your recommendations for achieving a greater reliability between the coders? Because it's a lot of information, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Of course, getting this good inter-rater reliability is always tricky when you do coding work like this, but it's really important to be able to draw meaningful conclusions. Yeah, what we did is just make very, very extensive manuals and do lots of training together. I think this really helps because when you have vague ideas about what categories are, what is the definition of a gesture, what is not a gesture, then this will of course differ a lot across different people, across different coders. But when you have stricter rules that have a lot of examples as well, then this usually improves a lot.
Okay. And what would be your recommendations? I mean, because we're right now trying to create like a coding system for one research that we have in progress about babies and infants performing gestures. So we're also trying to do this manuals as to know what are we referring to one kind of gesture, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, besides like agreeing and having these meetings, I don't know, what else do you think we need to consider to be more confident with our coding system?
Hmm.
Yeah,
A
right.
good question. It's difficult to say without knowing the specific data. But I think one thing that always helps if you go through a part of the data together to really establish what are we really trying to look at and what do we really want to know. Because of course, making such a coding manual and thinking about it beforehand is very different from actually looking at the data, and then you always encounter problems again. And then you have to go back and change the coding manual, and then you have to go back and change the coding again.
Right.
So that's always a tricky thing. But I think it really helps if you have some data sessions where you look at the data together and really, try to get a good overview of what the data looks like before you actually start coding all the data.
Okay, awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that would be great. And also, we have some more questions from our audience, so we still have time for a few more. And do you have already a guess about which specific gestures would have similar effects? For instance, the audience is asking, like, I'm thinking of interactive gestures that may occur at the end of an intervention that probably could give more info.
Yeah, no, I think looking at other types of gestures is a really interesting step forward. I think these could also have effects on fast responding, but probably through very different mechanisms. So actually in our lab, we did one study where we also had participants answer questions that were based on videos, like some of the work I showed. And then the actors would either do, or I think it was an avatar actually in this case, would either do a palm up open hand gesture like this at the end of the question, or she wouldn't. And there actually we didn't find that these types of gestures speed up responses. This could also have to do with the fact that these gestures may be even more sensitive to the fact that it's an avatar and that it's not a real interaction, and that an avatar is of course processed differently. So perhaps these gestures really need to have social interaction, really need to have this face-to-face context for them to really work. But I think, I'm also very interested in seeing sort of what kind of things could the face do for prediction of what type of question is someone going to ask. Is it going to be a very critical question or asking for information? And knowing this type of question early on is also very important for planning the response and being able to respond quickly. So I think that's also a very important next step.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And well, one last one from me. I have one last question that right now that I've seen that you have like these real interactions, actresses and videos, or the manipulation of the videos. What would be like the differences that you're perceiving that probably responders are having according to these different context of getting the information on gestures? Do you think that would be like a difference between these kind of expositions or contexts that you find?
Of course, I think they must be a little bit different. But what's interesting about my work is that actually we see very similar effects across these different contexts. So, for example, the gesture speeding up responses, we see it in natural conversation, we see it with the actress, we see it with the avatar. So I think it's also really cool to see how it's actually generalizing across these different settings in a very robust effect. And the same with the prediction effects. So I think we need to do more work to see whether there are maybe more subtle differences. But as a first step, seeing that it's actually the case across all these different settings, I think is very cool and very convincing as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you. So there's a lot of work to do, right? with this,
always.
with this kind of methodology. Yeah. Okay, I know. Well, I guess that will be all from us. I think, and thank you very much for this interesting talk that you have provided right now. So just let me well, we deeply appreciate your presentation. So it's the responses, I think they were very useful to our attendees, and it's been an honor to have you. So just let me round up with the final part for this presentation in Spanish.
Yes,
so,
of course.
Thank you. Les agradecemos a la doctora Terbeque por esta conferencia a los asistentes en YouTube que nos están viendo en este momento por acompañarnos, al equipo de la ENALLT por el apoyo técnico, para la realización de la conferencia y también a nuestros colegas de la Facultad de Psicología que nos apoyaron también en esta transmisión. Y muchísimas gracias por estar aquí y los esperamos en nuestra siguiente conferencia. Muchas gracias y buena tarde. Okay, I think we have already stopped the transmission. Fernanda, ya acabamos, ¿verdad? La transmisión en YouTube. Oh, bueno, ya, creo que ya. Our audience is saying thank you a lot in YouTube. I'm just having the chat there, so they were, I guess, very excited about it. Thank you very much. We had like more than 25 people watching
really?
the transmission, and you can also see it later if you want to. And I think I gave you the link. If